Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 5, the 5th and final day of the First Stand 2025 group stage. By the end of today, we're going to know our first team officially eliminated from First Stand. Technically, our first region officially eliminated from First Stand here today. We'll know our matchups going into the best of fives, the semifinals of this tournament that we, of course, cover tomorrow on this channel. There's no break in between the end of groups and the start of the bracket stage. It all bleeds one into another, but today is by far the most important day for all 4 teams that are participating. Now, obviously, the degrees of importance are a little bit higher or lower for specific teams. We've got a couple of teams that have already qualified, but still a lot on the line. If you want to know my thoughts on how this tournament has gone so far, check out the playlist up on the iCard. That's going to have every single day of First Stand done in a very similar format to what you're getting today. Of course, the primer will be there as well if you want to get an idea of what I thought of these teams before the tournament. Spoiler alert, there are definitely some shocks. The team that I expected to go out is not going out. They're already locked safe going into the final day here, which is pretty spectacular, but depending on the results of today, we could be seeing a variety of different outcomes, which of course we went over at the end of day number 4. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the best of 3s, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We already talked about it a bit, but at the end of this episode, not only are we going to talk about the team that gets eliminated first from this tournament, but we will be going over the semifinals matchups as well. I'll be giving my predictions on who I think will be making the finals and kind of giving expectations for what you can kind of expect out of those 2 series, but most of today will be spent talking about this 5th and final day, so let's get into it. Let's get into the series themselves, and the first one is arguably the most important series that we've had at this tournament so far, especially with the way that things have gone down. This is going to determine a lot as to who is safe versus who is not. It doesn't lock anything in by any means. There are technically still outs for other teams to be able to, swing things in other directions, but this is probably going to be the series that determines which team will be eliminated first, and neither of the teams that are on the edge are involved in this series, and that's what makes it so interesting. It's a matchup between the representative from the LCP in CTBC Flying Oyster and the representative from the LPL in Top Esports. The reason that this series basically determines everything moving forward is because the way that the tiebreakers work at First Stand is it doesn't have anything to do with actual game score. I mean, it would get there theoretically if you were in like a longer tie, but most of the tiebreakers at this tournament come down to head-to-head, and for multiple teams at this tournament, their head-to-head scores are very varied. K-Corp needs a Flying Oyster win in this series in order to stay alive. If the Flying Oysters lose, if Top Esports end up picking up the win in this series, then they are out regardless of what else happens in the series later today. K-Corp needs CFO to be able to win in order to stay alive, but Team Liquid, the North American representative, they kind of really need Top Esports here. There still is obviously a way for them to stay safe. If CFO wins, they can still win later today in their matchup against Hanwha Life, but they're major underdogs in that series, and things get a lot more simple for them if Top Esports just come out and actually get the job done against CFO, because then even if Team Liquid lose, they're in a tiebreaker against K-Corp, who they beat. They have the head-to-head tiebreaker over that, and so the stakes have become very clear. Team Liquid looking for a Top Esports win, K-Corp looking for a CFO win. Now, what does that actually mean for these 2 teams in the series? What are they playing for? Well, CFO is playing for a top 2 seed, because right now, they're guaranteed to get into the top 4. There's no way that they're not going to make it sitting at 2-1, and they've already overperformed so much at this tournament. Quite frankly, this has already been one of the best runs that this region has had in a while. I'll talk about that and touch upon that a bit more in just a second, but I think the thing that they're playing for here is side selection going into these best of 5s. We've talked about it a lot this year. Like, Red Side's been better at this tournament than it has been at other tournaments, like domestically throughout the year, but for the most part, Blue Side has actually determined quite a lot of the highest profile series in the LCK and in the LPL throughout this year. We've talked about it a lot, again, on this channel, and having side selection for a best of 5 is actually a pretty big advantage in the current meta, and is something that I'm sure CFO would really like to have. That's what they're playing for. They're not playing for their lives or anything like that, but CFO is definitely playing to make sure they're in the best possible position to be moving on to that next round. Also, getting the number 2 seed over the number 3 seed or something like that could potentially get you an easier opponent just based off of the way that tiebreakers end up working out. And that's kind of what you really want to see for CFO. This team wants to get to finals. That should be the goal at this point. And for Top Esports, they are technically still playing for their own survival. If they lose here in this series and Team Liquid pulls off the upset later today, that's the way that Top Esports can be the team on the outside looking in. It technically is still possible for the LPL to be the one region that ends up missing the best of 5 stage. Obviously, that's the least likely outcome from today, is both Top Esports and Hanwha Life losing, but if they win here, they guarantee their spot into the next round. They don't have to think about it really at all, and quite frankly, they start building some much needed confidence that they genuinely need to build in order for me to feel comfortable at all about them moving into the next round. If they lose this series, even if HLE ends up winning, that puts them in a really bad spot, because then they might have to face HLE in the first round of the best of 5s. This could be a team that isn't a finals team just purely based off the fact that they don't have the record to get there, and that would be an absolute disaster for Top Esports. So it kind of is a must-win for them, if for nothing else other than to not only guarantee their spot and have it in their own hands, but also like to build some semblance of momentum going into that best of 5 stage, and CFO want to do the same. Now, matchup-wise, I certainly think it's hard to bet against Top Esports when you look at these matchups. Kanavi is a great early game jungler, and Junjia, historically speaking, has struggled in the early game. Now, Junjia has been fantastic at this tournament in the jungle position, which is great to see because he has had his bevy of international struggles. I think 369 going into either rest or driver could be a very positive Top Esports matchup, and Hongq, the youngest player at this tournament at 17 years old, he's going into Cream, who's, again, a very mechanically talented lane-dominant mid laner. I could see those being issues, but if bot lane can step up, just like they did against Team Liquid when they won yesterday in that very, very big win for them, if Hongq can be great in the way that he was against APA, if Junjia can continue to actually have really good early and mid games, which is not something he's always done at an international level, that's ginormous. There's a lot of familiarity between these players. Kanavia has faced Junjia a lot before when Junjia was in the LPL. Doggo has faced Jackie Love for many years when Doggo was in the LPL, and so it's not like there's an unfamiliarity between these players that are playing off against each other. This feels more like a domestic matchup than it does like an international one, but it's still fun regardless. So we've hyped it up enough. We've talked about the stakes. Let's get into the analysis. Let's go ahead and start with game number 1 and get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was CFO. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And oh my god, we are on upset alert. It was kind of feeling like a bit of a, oh, you know, if Top Esports loses, then things can get a bit more interesting, but we're not really expecting TES to continue their struggles going into this series against CFO. Well, here's CFO coming out in game number 1 and just outplaying Top Esports, being the better team, having better setups, and being able to take advantage of TES's weaknesses a lot better than a lot of other teams. Remember, Top Esports has not picked up a game win against anyone not named Team Liquid when they 2-0'd them earlier on in this tournament. They lost 0-2 to K-Corp, and they lost 0-2 to Hanwha Life. They're now down 0-1 against CFO. This is not a team that's looked particularly good at this tournament, and I think we were all kind of expecting this to be the get-right series for them, the one that kind of gets them back on the right track and gets their confidence back so they can go into the best of 5s and, you know, perform well enough to get to the finals. That does not look like it's going to happen, at least here after game number 1, because CFO is taking it to them, and honestly, like I said, is outplaying them. I think both of these teams have win conditions. I think some are much easier to execute than others, in my opinion. CFO's is super straightforward, and it's very easy to talk about. The mid-game skirmish potential of this comp is ridiculous. Jace spikes in the mid-game. Talia very much spikes in the mid-game. Ezreal really spikes in the mid-game. You're looking at a team that's basically entirely built to win a lot of these poke skirmishes around these objectives. You can set up 4v4 around Rift Herald, or you can set up around Otacon or something like that to be able to just completely poke out the enemy team with Jace plus Ezreal, and then use Talia or Sejuani or an Alistar flank to end up like punishing that on the back half. That is the plan here for CFO, because they don't really have a lot going for them in a lot of other areas. Like, I don't think they have a good early game. Top Esports early game is definitely better. You're basically looking at 3 winning lanes here in terms of the actual setup. K'Sante can really shut down the Jace early pressure. Yone definitely is going to be able to outpressure Talia. 1v1 in the mid lane, and Jhin, Leona, I think, should be able to do more than Ezreal, Alistar down in the bot lane. That would be my assumption. Of course, all of that pairing up with a Nidalee in the jungle to be able to create that early pressure is massive for Red Side in favor of Top Esports here, and I would argue that they scale better in this game. I certainly think they have more damage the later this game goes, because because as we've seen, Jhin can actually be a pretty priority carry, definitely is a good secondary carry later on in these games, and Cream, I think, should be in a great spot on this Yone to be able to win late. CFO don't really have any team fighting here. You've got the Sedge and Alistair for frontline, but outside of that, you're hoping and praying that you can, like, poke out top esports and siege down turrets before any of these fights start. Like, that's really your win condition. You drafted a poke comp. You need to be able to win these mid-game skirmishes, and luckily for CFO, despite the matchups that I don't think are necessarily super favored for them, they actually just played the early game better. They certainly played the mid game better, and then once you start getting into these later fights, they just had too big of a gold advantage for TES to be able to come back in. Player of the game for me is going to go to Doggo on the Ezreal. Ezreal's really risen in priority at this tournament, and I honestly can definitely see why. He's one of those champs that we talk about all the time. He just kind of does everything. There are a lot of champions in the game that are very specific in terms of the role that they accomplish right now, and so when you can find a champ that is good, has good numbers, and can function well in most stages of the game, but especially one that specializes in playing around mid-game team fights, like, that's really valuable, and I think the safety of Ezreal alongside the damage he's able to output later on in games, it just brings this consistency to team comps that a lot of teams want to opt into. Of course, so many AD carries have so much experience and so much practice on Ezreal as a champion that you're not surprised to see this be a comfort pick for a lot of the ADCs here, but Doggo has been exceptionally good at this tournament. Like, genuinely, he's been the second best AD carry, only behind Viper, at this tournament, and I don't even think it's really all that close in terms of production. Him and Kaiwing have been excellent as a duo. All of that hyping up that we did for them going into the tournament, and then me being like, you know, they've been awesome domestically, I just don't know if they're going to be able to hang with all of these other great bot lanes. They've been better than all of these other great bot lanes. They were better than Yon and Core JJ, they were better than Khalees and Targamas, and right here, they're better than Jackie Love and Crisp. They've just been able to really run a lot of this tournament through their bottom lane, and it continues to be a big positive. Kaiwing is obviously a big part of that as well. I haven't given as much praise to Kaiwing. I'm not necessarily saying he's played worse than Doggo, just that Doggo, I think, has been exceptional at this tournament. Hongq has really impressed me. Honestly, he just gapped Cream in terms of pressure and priority in the mid lane here, which I think is exceptionally cool to see. Again, Hongq's the youngest player at this tournament. He's 17 years old. This is a rookie mid laner for CFO, and he is showing up in a big way. He was awesome for this team domestically in the playoffs, was their team fighting ace, like definitely the one to kind of be able to consistently win the most amount of games, especially in the 5v5 stage, but he has been exceptional in lane and out of lane at this tournament. We could be looking at a potential like APAC superstar here in Hongq with how young he is and just how well he's playing already. Like, if this guy continues to run the region for a while, I'm not going to be surprised because it genuinely is looking that good right now. Junji has had a ridiculously good tournament coming out of the jungle position. There are a lot of junglers that have struggled, Kanavi included on the other side of this, that, you know, Junji has taken advantage of. People have talked about his international struggles, but they've not been here at this tournament, not at all. He has been everything he is supposed to be at a tournament like this. I don't want to call him like the GOAT of the region, because obviously you have all the Flash Wolves guys from back in the day. You have Karsa, you have Maple, and they're definitely the GOATs of the region. Sword Art, like, they're definitely the GOATs of the region. But Junji is definitely like the modern GOAT of APAC, of the PCS, of like that entire, you know, region, that entire ecosystem. Junji has been the guy over and over again to be able to make it work at the top of the standings, and he's not been able to show up internationally. Well, here he is at first stand, probably playing his best international tournament ever. You have Rest in the top lane, who obviously I was kind of, I don't want to say dogging on, but I called him the worst top laner at this tournament. I called him the worst player at this tournament heading in with my primer because I just wasn't all that impressed with his domestic play. He's been the better of these two top laners between him and Driver at this tournament, and he's been able to gap a lot of really good players. He was awesome in this game on the Jace. Overall, you just feel really good about CFO. It's not so much, oh, top esports continuously shit the bed, which they do, and I'm going to talk about that, but CFO is a team that you genuinely have to start getting concerned about. This team is not just like a good team for, you know, the West who's underperforming. This is like a genuinely really good team that can compete near the top of the LoL esports world. And for top esports on the other side, like, oh my god, panic mode, like, slam the button. Obviously, you're not in that much danger to be eliminated today so long as Hanwha Life don't completely throw things away against Team Liquid, but the only way that it's even possible for you to not make the next round is for you to lose this series first and foremost, and you're getting outplayed by CFO. Like, you cannot be in the position that you are in right now. There is no good outcome for top esports if they lose this, and they are on the back end of this series. Crisp was awful. He's gonna get dud of the game. This is one of those classic games where everybody looks at Crisp and talks about him inting. It's hard to like really pinpoint exactly what the issue is with Crisp in these games because he's not really doing all that different of stuff as he does when when they like win and when he looks really good, and he has looked really good at this tournament for the most part. He's been probably the most consistent player on the entire team so far at this tournament, but his bad games are awful, and he had one of the bad games here. Cream got completely outplayed in the mid lane by Honkyu. Again, a 17-year-old with no international experience. That's unacceptable for someone like Cream in a good matchup with a Nidalee in the jungle. 369 was not nearly as good as Rest on the other side of this. Jackie Love has been super disappointing at this tournament. Like, Kanavi is getting out-pressured in the early game as Nidalee against a Sejuani with a player who's not an early game focused player and Junji on the other side. Like, it's a disaster. It's crumbling and caving in around Top Esports. They have to right the ship as quickly as possible. If they lose this game number 2, the best case scenario for them is that they have to play the toughest team in the tournament in round number 1. And so it's really not a great situation for Top Esports to be in, but the series isn't over. We could definitely see this team win 2 games in a row. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility to see them be able to turn things around. We just need to see it. And for CFO, if they can close this out in 2, if they end up taking down everybody at this tournament except Hanwha Life, you're actually looking at a team that might be the number 2 team at this tournament, which is ridiculous. So which one of those is it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was CFO. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and disaster has struck for multiple teams at this tournament, and one team that looked absolutely doomed at the beginning of this tournament, starting 0-2, has found their breath of life with CFO's victory here. K-Corp has found themselves guaranteed into the top 4, and that feels impossible to say, but it's the situation we find ourselves in, because no matter the result of the next series, Top Esports lost here, so either HLE is able to pick up the series against Team Liquid, they all have a 3-way tiebreaker, which Team Liquid loses, and they're the team that's out, or Team Liquid somehow upsets Hanwha Life Esports, gets their second win, keeps themselves safe, and that's the only avenue for Top Esports to be eliminated, because they lose the tiebreaker to K-Corp when they lost that series. And so K-Corp is guaranteed top 4 after this series because the Flying Oysters were able to get the job done. Europe is throwing a parade. France in particular is throwing a parade for the Oysters right now. They are chugging them down at the current moment. It's absolutely ridiculous that they were able to pick this up. But for Top Esports, what is going on? Like, genuinely, what is happening to this team? They won the LPL for a reason. They were clearly a top 2 team at the very worst in the LPL. The only team that they have lost to throughout the entirety of this year was the team that they beat in the finals, who was undefeated going into the finals in anyone's legend. They beat Billy Gaming. They beat JD Gaming. They beat Ninjas in Pajamas. They beat Invictus Gaming. They beat all the teams they were supposed to beat. All of these other really good teams that are, you know, good representatives for the LPL in international tournaments like this. Top Esports was definitively better than them, and yet once again, we are seeing them in an international tournament, and we are seeing them disappoint. It doesn't matter the players, it doesn't matter the coaching staff, it doesn't matter the infrastructure. The organization is cursed. Like, there is nothing else to say at this point. It's genuinely absurd to see what keeps happening to Top Esports, but now that we've kind of gotten all of the superlatives out of the way, let's actually talk about this game, because I think there is some interesting things to talk about when it comes to this matchup for CFO and Top Esports. Once again, I don't think this is like a super CFO favored draft. I do think that there are things that you can look at positively. I really hate R5 Caitlyn this game. Like, I really just don't think it does all that much. Caitlyn Nautilus into Corki Poppy, I don't even think is a winning lane for Caitlyn. Like, I don't even think she can punish that really all that much. Corki does a really good job of being able to, like, stay alive and stay strong in the 2v2 down in the bot lane right now. That's really where his strength is at. And I think you're looking at a couple of other matchups that are also not super favorable. Sylas obliterates Azir. This is one of Azir's worst matchups in the entire game. This is why you don't blind pick Azir. Finally, there's a mid laner out there that actually picked something punishing. Oops, he lost on it anyways because he played like garbage in this game, which we will get into. Like, Sion is good on the top side, and I do like the scaling here. Top Esports don't really have a consistent team fight at the end of the game because you don't really have frontline here for this team. Like, the Rumble, the Sylas, the Corki, they're all going to be problems in terms of team fighting, but it's really hard to keep them safe from a potential like Skarner ults or Nautilus engage or Azir just like finding a great Shuriman and shuffle. Like, there's really not a lot of ways for this team to actually be able to play front to back, so you kind of have to find picks over the course of this game if you're Top Esports. And for CFO, I think you have a much easier way to play out a lot of these fights because you do have so much setup and frontline, and you still have damage. Like, Azir is obviously primary carry worthy in terms of the damage he can output in the mid lane, but it's not like Caitlyn is not going to be a really dangerous champion to play. I just don't think she's going to be as useful in this game because her early game isn't going to be quite as consistent as it would be in punishing other matchups. This is not the game that I think Caitlyn really thrives in. That being said, like, CFO just played better. Like, there's nothing else to say. This is a matchup where they probably shouldn't be able to fight a lot in the mid game, and yet they just outplayed them. They were just better, and that's why they ended up walking away with a victory here. Player of the game and player of the series to me as a whole is going to go to Hanwha in the mid lane, and maybe this is a bit of a controversial or not popular opinion. Junjia, I think, definitely deserves it for this Skarner game. I think Doggo also was in the running for me for player of the series, maybe not player of the game, but Hanwha was unreal in this series. Going into a player like Cream, who has kind of taken down the gauntlet of like the best LPL mid laners of all time on his way to representing the region at this tournament, like just completely outplaying him in what I would consider to be one of Azir's worst matchups is so ridiculously impressive. I can't even begin to start explaining like why that is so good. He is so talented. I'm actually so impressed with him. I'm serious. This is a 17-year-old kid that we're going to be talking about in a year or two as being like the best player in APAC, and someone that I think I'm not going to try and say that like, oh, you know, the LCP is going to get rated again by the LPL, because I'm not quite sure how common those days are. But if I'm an LPL team, especially like a mid-table LPL team that needs a mid laner, boy, am I looking at Hanwha for next year. Like, boy, am I going, we could be getting that guy in, because I think he could be a top of the LPL type of talent, similar to what something like someone like Karsa or Sword Art or Fofo have been able to do in the LPL, where they've been able to make that transition into being one of the better players in the region. Hanwha is good enough to be able to make that, or at least it looks like he's on that trajectory right now. I'm so impressed with him. Junjia was awesome once again in this series, just out-jungled Kanavi, and Kanavi's been getting out-jungled at this tournament. We'll talk about him more when we get to the other side of this matchup, but Junjia has impressed me so much at first stand. He has legitimately been the best jungler at this tournament. Like, I love Peanut, and Peanut's been really good. I think Junjia has been the player I've been the most impressed by out of that position at the entire tournament. It's actually ridiculous how good he's been. Doggo and Kaiwing have been awesome, like top 2 bot lane without any sort of parallel, without any sort of question marks. Driver has continued to play a lot of these like weak side tanks top, which is not necessarily his own personal play style, which I really encourage. It's just really fun for CFO. There's not much else to say other than congratulations to this team. Remember, they beat all of the other bottom tier teams at this tournament. They beat Top Esports, they beat K-Corp, and they beat Team Liquid, and they didn't really look all that pressed in either of those series, in any of those series. The only team that they lost to was Hanwha Life, who looks unstoppable at the top of the league right now. CFO might actually just be the second best team at this tournament, and they're going to have a chance to prove it. They're going to be the number 2 seed going into that next stage. I'm very excited to see that. They get side selection, and they're going to get the chance to kind of prove all of the people who doubted them even more wrong. The crazy thing about this is, I kind of want to point this out. I got a comment. Shout out the commenters. By the way, you guys have been awesome for First Stand, talking about like, oh, you know, like APAC, PCS, SEA, like they've been good for a very long time. Like they've been taking games off of the major regions, and I agree with that, right? Like obviously this region has a really rich history. I don't think that's necessarily been the case in modern history. When you talk about the last time I really felt like a PCS team or an APAC team or whatever, an LMS team had been competitive, like, or expected to be competitive to make, like, I don't know, the quarterfinals of Worlds or be like a top 8 team in the world, was probably 2021 PSG Talon when they did really well at MSI. That was probably the last time that you were looking at a team from this region, or this like idea of a region, I guess, since it's changed so much, being able to actually compete near the top of the standings. Like, there is a really strong argument to be made that this is the best performance that this region has had since Flash Wolves was at like the height of their dominance. Like, this is the best international tournament that like APAC or the, you know, the LCP or whatever, right? Like whatever you want to call the region, this is probably the best performance they've had in over half a decade. Like, it's actually awesome to see, and they're really starting to emerge as world favorites once again. Maybe not like, you know, World's Finals favorites, but like, dude, they just destroyed Top Esports, the winner of the LPL. Who's to say this isn't a team that can make the quarters or the semis at Worlds? Like, it's actually awesome to see how they played here. And then for Top Esports on the other side, disaster has struck. Worst case scenario has existed. You went 1-3 in the group stage. You are hoping and praying that Hanwha Life actually cares about this final series. They have no reason to care. They've locked in the number 1 seed. Even if they lose this series, they're the number 1 seed because they have the tiebreaker over CFO going into the best of 5 stage. They have literally nothing to play for. You have to hope that an HLE team with nothing to play for can actually show up on the final day here and win their final series, because if not, you are the first team eliminated from First Stand, and as the representative of the LPL, that is unacceptable. And quite frankly, their performance and their results at this tournament have been unacceptable. I can't stress enough, it's not just the fact that they have, lost all of these series. They're not even winning games. 0-2 against CFO, 0-2 against K-Corp. Like, it's unacceptable. 0-2 against HLE is fine, I guess, but like, you didn't even take a game off of either Europe or APAC in this entire tournament. It's actually ridiculous. And now, best case scenario for you, you're sitting at number 4 in terms of seeding, because if HLE wins, then Team Liquid's out, you lose the tiebreaker to K-Corp, you're the number 4 seed. Oops, you gotta play Hanwha Life in round number 1. You're probably not making finals. This is like a disaster for the LPL, and it's all of the players. It's every single player on this team. Obviously, Crisp was awful in game number 1, but Kanavi's gonna get done of the game for game number 2. What was this tournament from Kanavi? I've never seen him play this bad in my entire life. I actually think this is the worst tournament I've ever seen him individually play. Cream got completely outplayed by a 17-year-old with no major international experience. Jackie Love wasn't even a top 280 carry at this tournament. 369 couldn't do anything on the top side, even after picking B1 Rumble. Like, there's just nothing else to say. Every single player on this team deserves the criticism for it, and they might get a chance to continue to play, and who knows, maybe they pull off a gigantic upset moving forward, but it's out of their hands now. They might not even get to play another game at this tournament because they disappointed so much in all of these series. The fact that it's even up in the air in the first place is already such an indictment, and now we're looking at a situation where it's not just them that they've let down, it's North America that they have let down as well, who now has to, come and win against all odds later on in the day. Top Esports has done absolutely everything in their power to throw this tournament into absolute chaos, and you know what? I'm super here for it. Like, I know it's obviously fun to love the top teams and to respect how good the LPL has been. I've been a big LPL believer over the past couple of years, but this has been such a fun tournament because Top Esports has not been who we thought they were going to be, and because the bottom of this table has become a lot more interesting than we were expecting. And, I think that certainly counts for something, but once again, congratulations to CFO. They deserve all of the praise that they're going to get for a series like this, and for a tournament like this. It might not even be done yet. Depending on the result later today, we could be looking at a CFO team that, could be going to the finals of an international tournament, which would be maybe the single best result that this region has ever had. But then moving on now to our second series of this final day, and this series has become a lot more important than maybe we thought it was going to be going into today after the result of the first series. Of course, one of these teams now needs to win in order to keep their entire tournament hopes alive. The other team doesn't have a ton to play for, but it still could be interesting. It's a matchup between the representative from the LTA in Team Liquid and the representative from the LCK in Hanwha Life Esports. HLE, they've got everything locked up. There's nothing to play for except for pride. At this point, they want to go undefeated in the actual group stage here. They probably want to go undefeated in terms of series score throughout the entire tournament. It feels like they are pretty heavy favorites. They're clearly the best team at this entire tournament. The only other team that's even been remotely consistent in CFO, HLE absolutely obliterated when those two teams played against each other, and so they feel pretty confident that they can probably walk out of this tournament without having dropped a single best of, which, is definitely kind of the expectation for them. But Team Liquid has everything on their shoulders at this point. At the very least, they'll get a chance to play for their own safety, but this is it. This is the final series of the group stage. If Team Liquid win it, they are in. If they lose it, they are out. It could not be more straightforward for Team Liquid, and unfortunately for them, they're going up against the best team in the entire tournament, which is really not a great situation for them to be in. How did they get here? Well, they're the only team at the tournament to lose to Top Esports, which is certainly not a good distinction at the current moment, although at the time, that felt entirely expected. Nobody was shocked or surprised by that outcome. We shouldn't be surprised or shocked in any way by that outcome. Team Liquid should be worse than Top Esports, but they are the only team at this tournament to lose even a game to TES, and then they also lost to CFO. Like, they held this in their own hands. If they could actually take down the Oysters, which they should be able to do by all accounts, then they would be safe here. They wouldn't have to play for their own safety against the best team in the tournament. They had opportunities to be able to keep themselves in an okay position, and they didn't utilize them, and so now it comes down to them being able to pull off an upset without their head coach here, which is a really, really bad situation for them to be in. Obviously, there were a ton of issues, in my opinion, with how they constructed not only their drafts, but their gameplay plans yesterday. I'm not sure how much of that is Spawn not being here. I don't even really think all of it can be put on Spawn not being here. Like, obviously the head coach plays a role in that kind of stuff, but you're trying to tell me they didn't have all of this stuff already planned out before he left? Like, he has made it clear, especially now with his statement coming out on social media these past couple of days or the past couple of hours, that it was always the plan for him to leave, for him to not be full-time, at least in person. Like, he's going to be working remote with the team for a lot of the rest of the year. He still is with Team Liquid, but he's just not going to be, like, on site for the entire year. This was always the plan, so clearly they had some sort of idea of what they wanted to do, and yet, like, they overthought the problem. They put Ziggs for Yon in the bot lane, they drafted Corki mid, and just had no prio. It didn't really feel like they had an understanding of how to play out their draft once they did end up drafting it. Like, they just looked a bit scattered, and they're going to have to look a lot more clinical in this series if they even want remotely a chance to beat HLE. What I really do think they're going to have to play through is just a bot lane pop-off game, and I know that feels crazy to be like, Yon has to be better than Viper, but when you're looking down the line at all of these other matchups, like, you're not going to find a lead anywhere else. Impact has just not been good enough at this tournament. I would argue he's been Team Liquid's worst player at this tournament, and it's certainly up for debate, but I think he is kind of winning that race at the current moment. Has only really looked good against Yike, who was running it at the beginning of this tournament, and outside of that, he's kind of been the we all expected. APA has looked fine, and I'm not, like, against APA. I think in the right circumstance, he can be useful and valuable, but there is, like, an inherent ceiling to what his, like, mechanical prowess will offer him, because he's just not a great laner, and so that when he goes up against the best mid laners in the world, or the players that really can exploit that, like, he's not going to be able to play against those teams and be as successful as he is domestically. It's got to be the bot lane. It's got to be Yon and Core. Luckily for Team Liquid, Yon and Core are good enough to be able to go toe-to-toe, even with Viper and Delight. I really do believe that they have the talent. It's all just going to be about the setup. Viper can be a kind of inconsistent player. He certainly has been over the course of this year. He's been very good at this tournament. Delight has been the best support in the world so far in 2025, and so it's not looking all that great, but I really do think that the Team Liquid, like, victory playbook includes Yon and Core getting super fed in at least 2 games of this series, because that's just what has to happen. Now, as for draft strategies, you gotta play comfort if you're Team Liquid. That has been what has gotten them to this point in the first place, is kind of drafting around what your player's strengths are. Let Yon and Core cook in the 2v2 and pick a jungler that can play for them, not only in the early game, but in the mid game in particular, around a lot of these skirmish fights, to let Yon be able to take them over. Let APA play something that either scales really heavily, like the Aurelion Soul, or get him on Talia or Ziggs, or one of his more comfort picks in that direction, right? Like, just let him play the champions he's good at. You don't have to rewrite the formula in order to allow him to be useful. You can't ban everything. You can't ban, you know, all of the bot laners and junglers that you want to get rid of for those players and get rid of APA's champion pool. You have to make some sacrifices somewhere, and then get impact on a tank on the top side, preferably Cassante, because that's really the only one he's been good at this year. So that's the strategy for Liquid. For HLE, they've been trolling with their drafts. Basically, this entire tournament, they've been picking things like Zed mid and Vladimir top. They picked Vlad twice, actually, in the top lane. Like, this is not a team that is afraid of trying things out. I think for Team Liquid, maybe you have to hope that HLE wants to cook even more in this series, and just hope and pray that they burn whatever is in the kitchen, and that they can come out with 2 random wins across this. I think that is genuinely the only hope for North America here, but can they do it? The only way to know is to go game by game, so let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and unfortunately for Team Liquid, basically all the things we asked for them actually happened here in game number 1. They were able to get the Ziggs in the mid lane. They got a bot lane that could be pretty strong in the early game, although not as strong as maybe you would like here with the Kalista Renata, because the Draven is the counter pick. You got an early game jungler that can help out with a lot of these mid game skirmishes, and the Cassante top lane for Impact to try and stabilize, and HLE kind of trolled draft. I'm not even gonna say kind of, really trolled draft. They have 3 picks here that I just do not understand, and we'll talk about that as we go further along, but even with all of that, all of those things compounding in favor of Team Liquid, they still were awful in this game. They still completely threw away this game number 1. A lot of really horrible individual plays coming in from the solo laners, and Umpty to a lesser extent, but it's just disappointing, right? Like, Team Liquid was basically given the free formula to win this game because Peanut and Delight were running it at the beginning of this game, basically for the first 15 minutes. Like, Team Liquid should have been able to capitalize and push their advantages more than they did, and it just did not happen. So we can go ahead and talk about it. The reason I say that HLE's draft is troll is only barely because of the Kayle in the top lane. You can see it, like the R5 Kayle for Zeus. It was awesome. It was dominant. He's getting player of the game for this Kayle performance on the top side. This is the first Kayle win in 3 years in pro play. Like, it's ridiculous what they've been able to pull out and win with. They already pulled out the Zed earlier on at the tournament. It's Kayle's turn now. It's ego check for Zeus and Zeka and basically everybody on this team, and they're all kind of passing it. But the Kayle's not even the pick that I think is all that bad here. I think Kayle's honestly fine in this matchup. I really don't hate the scaling opportunity that it gives you, kind of the out in the late game. The Pyke is an unacceptable support pick in this game. I get that you want to go for something super aggressive to try to take Jan out of his game here, out of his comfort zone, but like, I don't know how you're ever supposed to play Pyke into Kalista Renata. Like, this feels like a very, very hard laning phase for Pyke to end up playing out. Renata is already, like, enchanters are already really good into Pyke, and Renata in particular does a really good job at basically turning Pyke around, especially in team fights and a lot of these big skirmishes with that ultimate. And so I don't love the Pyke pick. I think the Rise on R4 is also just not very good. APA is the Ziggs player. Like, that's his best champion. It's always been his best champion, and I think Ziggs is really good into Rise. I think Ziggs should have a lot of priority in the early game there. Add on the Pantheon into that draft. Add on the fact that Jan is on something like Kalista that's been basically permabanned at this entire tournament, and you're looking at a situation where, like, Team Liquid was given a draft that they absolutely could have and should have won with, and Peanut and Delight both ran it down early. The Pyke did end up struggling early on in the game, mostly because Delight was just so aggro. Peanut was trying to follow up on a lot of those plays, and they were not going well for HLE, but despite all that, Team Liquid was somehow worse and not giving over free gold leads to HLE. All of those, kills going on to Kalista, all of that built up just for one shutdown onto the Kayle, and then the game is over. Like, Zeus just completely takes over from that point onwards. And like I said, he is player of the game. You got to give him credit. He's certainly not been shy about picking top laners at this tournament. 2 games of Vladimir, a game of Kayle. It's pretty ridiculous. Like, Zeus is clearly just feeling himself right now. He doesn't feel particularly challenged by a lot of the players he's playing at this tournament, and that has become abundantly clear. If he's going to be pulling out Kayle and doing this well on it, like, good luck to every other team at the tournament. There's basically no way to play around this. I think Zeka and Viper also had really good games. Again, I was criticizing the Rise pick because I don't think Rise is really great as a blind. I think he's a really good counter pick, and I think we've seen a lot of success out of that champion so far in 2025, but I wouldn't have gone for it. Doesn't really matter. Zeka is just way better than APA. This is such a gigantic, like, player diff in the mid lane that it's hard to really uphold any sort of draft ideology around it. Viper was really good on the Draven, was not giving over free shutdowns no matter how hard Team Liquid looked to try and shut him down in a lot of these instances. And even with Peanut and Delight kind of running it, it's not like Delight wasn't useful in the back half of this game on the Pyke. It ended up being valuable for him to be that champion. It just took him a bit of time to get there. So for HLE, like, you kind of trolled draft, you tried a lot of these crazy things once again, and you still ended up coming out on top because you are that much better than Team Liquid and basically every other team at this tournament. And for TL, that's the most worrying sign you could possibly be given here in game number 1, because how do you come back from that? How do you come back from a game that had everything that you were looking for in order to pick up a game win? Like, HLE saying, here you go on a silver platter, everything you ordered, and you still lose. Like, you still ended up dropping game number 1. It's really not a good look. Dud of the game is obviously going to go to Impact. I'm serious when I say that there is, like, a really strong argument that he has been the single worst player at First Stand. He has been unplayable, and that's kind of been the case for his international runs. Just in general, he's always been kind of bad for North America internationally. Like, obviously, you can look back on some of the really old runs with Cloud9 where things were going okay, but a lot of the modern runs from Impact internationally have just been horrific. He's always played worse when he goes up against better top lane talent, and it once again is happening here. He wasn't even that good domestically going into this tournament, but, like, I am, like, worried about Impact because his production and his performance so far this year is not even like a top 3 or top 4 top laner in North America type of production and performance. Like, he has just been unplayable, completely allowed Zeus to snowball this out of control, and just doesn't look comfortable on any champion in any playstyle, which is really, really concerning. Like, there's nothing good to say about that. If Vladi wasn't at this tournament, and if Vladi hadn't played the way that he had at this tournament, Impact would be like the easy front runner for worst player at First Stand. But it's right now between Vladi and Impact, kind of who you want to go for in that direction. I think Impact has made a strong case though, and then APA continues to just get outplayed by players that are better than him. I'm giving him a little bit of slack because at least it's more expected from APA, where he has, like, clear flaws individually as a player, and they're just being taken advantage of by Zeka and by really good players on the other side of this. The fact that he lost to Hongq was definitely more concerning, but it's APA. Like, you kind of saw this coming. Jan tried his best. He got a ton of gold in the early game from fighting really consistently. Him and Core actually did have a good game, but that shutdown going over to the Kayle, like, it's game over from there. There's no way to play it out at that point. I'm UMT continues to be feast or famine, giving over a ton of resources in order to try to gain resources, and it's just not a good trade against teams that are better than you, and that's why he's always been on bottom tier teams in the LCK, and so it just is what it is, right? Team Liquid look completely outclassed. A lot of the champions that they probably wanted to play in this series and are gone after game number one, like the Cassante and the Ziggs are both now gone after game number one. They don't have that option anymore, and, you know, HLE's going to continue to cook, and if they're going to win on these crazy picks, who's to say that them pulling out a regular draft doesn't mean a 20-minute win, right? Like, that's kind of the expectation now, but the only way to know if Team Liquid can stay alive in this series at all is to go over game number two. So who's it going to be? Well, the winner of game number two was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number two. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and we're going to a deciding game number three. It felt lost. It felt doomed, especially after game number one, but even most of the way through this game, it didn't really feel like Team Liquid was going to be able to close this one out. Like, they had every way to do so. They had Otacon. They've been stacking all of the dragons. They end up getting Mountain Soul. They end up getting Elder, obviously, which ends up ending the game. They have all 6 Void Grubs. Like, everything is kind of going in their favor, but all the while HLE is sticking in this game, and the closer and closer that this gold lead stays, the further along we get into this game, the more it becomes concerning that, like, none of that matters, that none of those things are important enough to give Team Liquid the advantage that they're looking for, that HLE is in the best possible position to win this game anyways, despite the fact that they ended up drafting another for fun draft. And you might not look at this and say for fun. I think that obviously the Quinn on R5 is definitely the one that people are going to look at and be like, you know, that's definitely a little bit of an out there pick. Zeus is playing on Iron Man mode right now, but this is a for fun draft for HLE because they picked Zyra Jungle for Peanut, which he has a 0% win rate on career-wise. He's continued to play it throughout all of this year, and he's never been able to win on it. He's constantly been the worst player in the game on it, and he did it again here. Even against Team Liquid, he still was the most useless player in the game. I do not know why they continue to put him on Zyra. It's absolutely astounding, but they did so, and I guess it ended up working out for Team Liquid. They're going to be pretty happy in that regard, but I think even outside of that, this is a pretty good draft for TL. I think this is definitely probably the most cohesive one not only they have had today, but I think anybody has had today. I think this is just kind of a win in the draft column for TL because you definitely outscale. Like, your team fight is way better. This is actually kind of a pretty classic FlyQuest draft in terms of how things go, mostly because of the Cassiopeia-Renekton solo lane duo. They definitely took some inspiration there from Bwipo and Quad, but Impact and APA were always going to be pretty useful throughout this game. Impact because he's Renekton early, and even going into something like Quinn, he can still skirmish pretty effectively, and the Cassio, the Varus, the Maokai, the later this game goes, they're going to be the most useful champions in this game. They're going to be able to carry a lot of the weight as we go further along, and so their team fight's going to be pretty good. And then you're also looking at most of these laning phases, specifically Cassio into Tristana, and even really Varus into Jhin, and going, that's kind of Team Liquid favored as well. I really like the Cassio on B3. I think it really ties everything together, but getting Yon on a champion he can take over on not only in the early game, but in the mid game and late game as well, I think was incredibly important, and you are seeing that here because Yon is going to get player of the game. We talked about it. He is the best player on Team Liquid. He's the best player in North America. He's probably the best player in the West right now, and getting him on a champion that actually can just kind of dominate the game, can actually scale really effortlessly. Something like Kalista is really strong, and it does play into Yon's strengths because he is such a good laner, but the problem with Kalista is you don't really have agency over how the game goes on your own. You kind of need the rest of the team to be in a good enough spot for you to be able to, like, solo carry in terms of the damage you're able to output. It's mostly just there for you to be able to win 2v2, to isolate that matchup and basically take out the enemy AD carry. That's what I think Kalista is mostly there for, and that's not really what you want Yon on in this series, in my opinion. You want him on something like Varus that can actively impact team fights and be the highest damage dealer in the game, and that's exactly what he was here, so credit to Yon. He really was spectacular. Core, of course, deserves a lot of credit for that as well on the Rakan. I think the bot lane was just better than Hanwha Lives in this game. The Jhin and the Rel really didn't have any sort of priority or pressure into the Varus Rakan, and I think that was huge. APA had a really excellent game on the Cassiopeia. Again, I know APA gets a lot of criticism, and, you know, he deserves a lot of it. Like, his bad games are kind of bad, but he can win, like, even at a top level. Like, I get this is a great matchup, but, like, this was a really good game from him on Cassio against arguably the best team in the world, regardless of how this series ends up panning out. Like, I'm very impressed with what I saw out of APA in this game. I'm very impressed with what I saw out of Yon and Core. I think Umti did a much better job now that he was on something like Maokai, something that definitely has less of an onus to be more aggressive in the early game, like the Pantheon. I think he's always been better at champions like Sejuani and Maokai as a facilitator player, especially in North America, and Impact just needed to not get absolutely obliterated obliterated on the top side for this team to be in a good spot, and he didn't. He was fine. He was honestly pretty okay on the Renekton in this game. So for Team Liquid, you feel really good about this game number 2. Obviously, keeping it alive is great, but you kind of outplayed HLE throughout a lot of this game. Now, it could have been cleaner. It certainly could have been better. This should have been a blowout in terms of how this draft ends up going, but at the end of the day, you won the game and you were the better team, so good on you. And then for HLE, like, again, they kind of trolled this game number 2, not only because the Quinn in the top lane is definitely a bit of an out there pick. I'm totally fine with the Quinn on R5. I think it's perfectly acceptable. I don't think it punishes the Renekton matchup as much as a lot of people would like to make it out to be, but I do think it's something that definitely makes Impact's life a lot harder. But Peanut on Zyra, man, like, dud of the game. Obviously, this dude can't play Zyra. There is nothing else to see. There is nothing else to say. It's not even just the fact that he's got a 0% win rate on it. Go watch the Zyra games that he has played. Go even just watch my reviews of the Zyra games on this channel that he's played throughout this year and throughout last year. He is abysmally bad at this champion. He just does not get it. He doesn't understand how she's supposed to operate. He can't play her in the early game. He can't play her in team fights. It, like, doesn't click for Peanut. I don't know why. It's totally fine. Not every player has to play every single champion, but stop picking it for him. Like, I get that you're up 1-0 and you want to try it out to see if you can win on it, but if you're getting obliterated by Team Liquid because you just can't play Zyra, then don't play Zyra. And luckily, it's Fearless. They can't play Zyra again, but it's ridiculous that they're even pulling it out at this tournament at all. Zeka also just was not very good in this game. Now, part of that is the matchup. Cassio is just a nightmare matchup for Tristana. There's very little that the Trist can actually do there, and that's the punishment for picking early Trist. If it were me, I would not have picked the Jhin on R1. I probably would have picked Trist plus, like, a better jungler on R2, like maybe Trist and Maokai on R2 for Peanut, and then, you know, flex the Tristan to the bot lane, because I think Tristan to Varus is actually very Tristana favored. I think that that would be something that I would be really excited about, but instead, because you early pick the Jhin, you get rid of that flexibility for Tristana, and she ends up getting counterpicked in the mid lane, and you can't really play it out. So, not really great for Zeka. You know, Zeus was fine on the Quinn, Delight was fine on the Rel, even Viper was fine on the Jhin, even if Yon was better on the other side. You know, there are pieces to take away from this, but we are looking at a 1-1 series, and it's a best of 1. Like, anything can happen in a best of 1. Team Liquid are certainly good enough to be able to take one more game off of HLE. Like, if HLE trolls again, I mean, they've been trolling, but if they troll again in draft, who's to say that TL doesn't have a shot to be able to keep themselves safe? I didn't even think they would be sitting here at 1-1, but they do have an opportunity to perhaps flip the entire script and be the only team to take a series off of HLE in the group stage. Are they going to be able to do it and keep their hopes alive, keep their tournament alive, or will they not be able to, and will they be the first team officially eliminated from first stand? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 2-1, and they will end off the group stage undefeated. I sound a little bit deflated after that game number 3, not because this was close or back and forth really in any conceivable way. This was an absolute decimation of Team Liquid, but because this is the expected outcome. No upset here today, at least an upset for K-Corp and not for Team Liquid. This is unfortunately the last game that they will play at the First Stand International Tournament. They will be the first team officially eliminated, the only team to not make the best of 5 stage, and, you know, I think a lot of it is on them. Like, they definitely had the opportunity to be able to secure their spot. If they had picked up a series win over either CFO or Top Esports, then they'd be in. It wouldn't even be close. If they beat TES on day 2, TES is gone. That's their only series win at this tournament, and so, you know, they had the chance to be able to make it their own, and they didn't. They were the worst team here, and their win over K-Corp in day number 1 was clearly not something that was particularly sustainable. That had a lot more to do, in my opinion, with K-Corp playing bad, rather than Team Liquid playing good, at least with the hindsight that we've seen from the rest of this tournament. K-Corp got their shit together and ended up performing much better than Team Liquid down the stretch, and quite frankly, Team Liquid probably was the weakest team at this tournament. I mean, Top Esports might be in the running for that, but, like, if you want to make the argument that TL was the weakest team at first stand, I think that that's totally viable. One thing that I want to put out there, though, the big takeaway from this, and just this situation in general, not that this is like an excuse or anything, but one thing that I think is kind of a side product of all of this, now North America has still only played one best of 5 in 2025. Like, the entire region combined only has played one best of 5 so far in 2025 on stage. It was the finals, and even that series only went 3 games. It was a 3-0 sweep for Team Liquid over 100 Thieves. Nobody, not a single North American team, will get to play a single series that has gone longer than 3 games going into the spring split. It's just such a massive disadvantage. I actually think the format has really hurt them. Again, I don't want this to come across across as me trying to find excuses for them, more just saying, like, this is the byproduct of TL actually missing out on the best of 5 stages. They don't even get one extra best of 5. Like, North America just gets completely screwed in that format, you know, by their own choices, by their own format decisions, and so you gotta kind of blame them for that. But for HLE, congratulations on the win. They continue to troll a little bit with these drafts. Only one weird pick, I would say, in this draft, and generally, I think that the comp itself is actually really cohesive. I think it gives them a very easy way to win the game. If they win early, it's like actually doomed for Team Liquid, which is exactly what ended up happening. If you can start playing through things like Mbessa Skarner on the top of the map, like Kassadin and Sivir is going to be unstoppable the later this game ends up going, and so you feel pretty good about that. But a Kassadin in the mid lane for Zeka is still crazy. These solo laners can't go a single game without drafting something absolutely ridiculous in the group stage here. Even when it's the final game of a series, a game 3 that they need to win, they still are willing to pull out a lot of these insane picks, and it does end up working out. For TL, honestly, I don't really know what you're thinking with this draft. You draft a lot of scaling, like Ivern, Victor, even Jax, like trying to play for split push in the later half of the game. Like, I get the idea behind that to give yourself an out for the later part of the game, but the problem is, you know, Ezreal's gonna get shoved into Oblivion against Sivir. Like, Yon's not gonna have any prio this game because there's just no way Ezreal can match the amount of push that that champion ends up having on the other side of that matchup, and Victor's not as strong as Kassadin in the late game. Like, you don't win late. Also, like, Jax is your out in terms of, like, a split push win condition, and Impact is, like, the worst Jax I've ever seen, even though he has a skin for him in the game, and we'll obviously get more to that, but I just think it's kind of a flaw in Team Liquid that they don't really have backup plans to their strategies, and I think it's been really heavily exposed throughout this tournament that when they get taken off of the things that they're very comfortable on, they kind of look bad as a team. So we'll get into it. Let's start with HLE. Player of the game for me is going to go to Zeka. Not player of the series, but player of the game on the Kassadin. I mean, he was awesome. Like, the Kassadin's the weird pick of this draft, and it ends up really working out. Zeka's really fun on champions like this. He's played Kassadin before in the LCK, and it's always looked a little bit interesting. I kind of think of this as a Showmaker pick, because Showmaker, I know, plays a lot of Kassadin, and that's kind of just the player I associate the champ with the most, but Zeka still pulls it out and makes it look all right. I don't think Kassadin's particularly viable if you're not, like, much better as the mid laner here, because you can't really contest all that effortlessly in the mid game. The skirmishing is not all that great. I think the fact that Sivir was going to have prio in the bot lane was always going to be a positive, and Peanut played a really nice game on Skarner in the jungle, and that obviously helps out Zeka in a lot of different ways, but he still had to come out and, like, absolutely obliterate people with his damage, and that's exactly what he did. But player of the series, this is a no-brainer. It's going to Zeus on the top side. I didn't have to think about this at all. He was the best player in this series, and honestly, Zeus has been, like, the best player in the world at times for a lot of this year. Again, I don't want to try and be hyperbolic when I talk about this, but I think the last, like, month of what we've seen from Zeus is the best we've ever seen from him for that long of a time. He's had really good flashes, like, at the end of the World Championships in 2023, like the semifinals going into the finals, Zeus was unreal during that run. Like, you can definitely point to multiple times where Zeus has been really good for a series or two, but I think when you look at the playoff run that they went through domestically going into First Stand and then now First Stand, like, this is maybe the longest stretch where we've ever seen Zeus play at this level, and that's really impressive, and HLE looked very dangerous because of it. The Mbessa was really awesome this game. His only death was to an errant Ezreal ultimate that ended up catching him on the top side. Outside of that, he, like, humiliated Impact. This was not even remotely close in the top lane, and the fact that Impact picked Jax into this matchup is disgraceful, and he got obliterated on it. We'll talk about that later, but Peanut was really good here in game number 3. Going Deathless on Skarner is really good for setup. I think the Sivir is actually a really smart pick here. Sivir Braum, I think, is a pretty difficult bot lane to end up trying to deal with, and Sivir just has so much shove and push into the Ezreal that it's really difficult for him to have any sort of priority. Yon's not going to be a big part of this game, really, ever on the Ezreal. The Sivir pick really does kind of take bot lane out of the equation for Team Liquid, which we talked about being the most important lane for them, and Delight was really good on Braum as well, but it's once again just kind of an expression, like, HLE is just way better than Team Liquid. A more neutral team matchup here could have been a more interesting game when it comes to this draft. Even then, I still favor HLE in terms of the draft here, but even outside of that, like, HLE was so much better. Like, it's actually ridiculous. They are the best team in the world right now, and it's not close. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, you sucked. Like, in this game, there's nothing to talk about. This is the worst game they played at this tournament. This was very reminiscent of K-Corp in the first couple of weeks, where just absolutely nothing is going right for this team. Impact is the easiest choice for dead of the game. With them being the first team eliminated now, with them, like, officially being out of the tournament, I think I can say confidently that Impact was the worst player at First Stand. Like, again, Vladi was really bad and continues to kind of be a negative on K-Corp even in their wins, but Like, Impact was so actively detrimental to this team in basically every series that they played. Even their series against K-Corp, like, he was the worst of those two top laners. Kana was the only player on KC that was actually doing anything. I'm just tired of Impact playing like this internationally. I've been talking about it on the channel for years, but, like, this guy doesn't have the reputation of playing bad internationally, and quite frankly, he absolutely should, because I can't remember the last time he went to an international tournament and wasn't one of the weaker top laners there. Like, it's just kind of been the reality of what Impact has been basically ever since, like, leaving that first core of Team Liquid, like the double lift Pobelter core of Team Liquid the first time. Like, ever since that stint, and even in that stint, right? Like, Impact has just not been a good international performer. You can look back statistically speaking. It's not a good track record, and I hate to say that that's just become a reality, but it just is what it is. Umti couldn't really do anything on the Ivern, and they were trying to capture some of that yike momentum that he's been able to generate with that champ. It did not work. APA did not process the Kassadin pick particularly well with the Victor here, and Jan and Core can't do anything this game. We already talked about it. Like, the Victor and the Jax have to be able to win this game for you, and that's a bet that HLE really liked. So overall, this tournament is a big dud for North America and for Team Liquid, for the LTA in general, in their first ever, I guess, like, LTA appearance at an international tournament. Team Liquid was able to pick up a regional rivalry victory against K-Corp, but they didn't pick up a single series outside of that. Yes, a game win over HLE is cool, but they were kind of trolling with the draft and even the gameplay that they were putting out there, and honestly, like, this is a result that should not have happened. Losing to CFO is pretty not acceptable for Liquid, despite how good CFO has been, and losing to Top Esports, considering the form that they're in, is kind of unacceptable. Again, they were the only team to even drop a game against TES throughout this entire group stage, and so they definitely deserve to be the first team out. But once again, congratulations to HLE for going undefeated in the group stage. They already had the #1 seed locked up. They didn't need to win this series in order to do that, but I do think they want to go for that undefeated run down the stretch here at First Stand, and they will definitely have the opportunity to do so. Alright, but that is going to do it for my day number 5 overview and analysis video for the First Stand International Tournament. And we are done with the actual group stage, with the round-robin stage of this tournament. It is down to the top 4 teams. We are moving on to the semifinals, which take place tomorrow. There is no break. There is no day off for any of these teams. They have to go immediately into these best-of-5s. Team Liquid, of course, like I said, the first team officially eliminated. They don't get a chance to play another best-of-5 at this tournament. They're going to have to stick with their one that they got so far in 2025, but the rest of these teams will have the opportunity. HLE will be going in as the #1 seed. They will be taking on the #4 seeded Top Esports, and that's what makes this so interesting, is because K-Corp does hold the tiebreaker over TES, they get the #3 seed, despite the fact that they were in the most amount of danger heading into this final day, and they didn't play a single game because TES couldn't get that job done. They now have to face Hanwha Life in the semifinals, which is, at least in my opinion, looking like a pretty insurmountable matchup for them. Not only have they really struggled to be able to do anything to anybody at this tournament, but HLE have looked pretty unstoppable at this tournament. To me, when you're predicting this matchup, we already talked about it a bit earlier on in the tournament, but you need a player like Cream to be able to step up. You need Kanavi to really look like one of the best junglers in the world, and right now those things just aren't happening for Top Esports. This is a very Hanwha Life favored matchup. I wouldn't even be surprised if this ends up being a 3-0 in favor of HLE. I'm going to say that HLE continue to try out a few of these draft things and we get a 3-1, but if this is a 3-0, I'm not going to be shocked. I think it's closer to being a 3-0 than it is to being a 3-2 in my mind. HLE are huge favorites, and I think Top Esports is going to go out here in the semifinals. They will not even make the finals of the first international tournament. And then the true intriguing matchup, a matchup between the CTBC Flying Oyster and Carmine Corp, like, that's ridiculous. We're getting this as a semifinals matchup. It's guaranteed. One of these two teams will be in the finals of the First Stand tournament, and for K-Corp to be one series away from the finals of First Stand after how they have played, how they started at this tournament, it's got to feel like a breath of fresh air, and to only have to go through the LCP in order to get there, that is a winnable series for K-Corp. Now, they didn't win it the first time these two teams played. Like, CFO has looked awesome outside of their series against HLE, but this is still not a perfect team. Right now, in terms of form, you have to consider CFO favorites. They've looked really good at this tournament, and I think for the most part, as long as Doggo and Kaiwing are going to be able to play the way that they have played so far at First Stand, you're probably looking at a team that just is better than K-Corp, because Hongq I really believe in. Vladi's just not in great form right now. You know, you're looking at Yike, who can be both good and bad for the team, but Junji, like I said earlier, has arguably been the best jungler at this tournament. They have the advantage of having that 6th man to play through the Fearless, especially the longer we go into these best of 5s. Like, CFO have a lot of things that I think are really beneficial to longer best of 5s. But one of the big caveats and reasons I gave for K-Corp really struggling at the beginning of the tournament that I think maybe kind of is true is they were the last team to get to Korea by a large margin. They had the least amount of time to get ready for this tournament because of how late the LEC ended up ending in comparison to a lot of the other regions who had way more time to get to Korea and prep for this tournament. They've now had a ton of time to get settled in, and they've looked a ton better the later this tournament has gone. Perhaps we're seeing K-Corp level up and get more used to the, surroundings and just get used to being in Korea a bit more like body-wise, and that could be a really big positive. Perhaps they could take it. I think this series is really interesting. Honestly, right now, I'm going to pick the upset here. I know that might not be super popular. I'm going K-Corp and I'm going 3-2. I think CFO absolutely can win this, and I really want to be wrong about this, but I think K-Corp is leveling up, and I'm going to kind of bet on my heart and maybe not on my head when it comes to this game and say that K-Corp will be able to take it. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below. I'm always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on all of that stuff, but that's gonna do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We'll be covering day number 6, day number 7, the semifinals, and the finals of this tournament as we continue to go along through the weekend. If you want those videos in your recommended, or if you want to get notified when they go live, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.